The second in the three-part series, SBI Managing Partner Tony Erickson is joined by J.D. Miller, author of The CRO's Guide to Winning in Private Equity. They continue their conversation with a new topic by diving into the complexities that come when navigating board meetings and highlight the importance of delivering value before, during, and after a conversation with the board. Their discussion provides helpful strategies to deliver information to the board in a way that is engaging and strikes a balance between transparency and strategy.
Hi, everyone. Want to welcome you to the second in our three-part series. I'm Tony Erickson, SBI's managing partner, and I'm pleased to welcome back J.D. Miller to our second episode of this series. So, J.D., considering your recent publication, we want to dive into some discussion around board meeting prep and communication. So, can you tell us your best or worst board meeting experience that we will make nameless? Feel free to, create names for the people involved and use pseudonyms if necessary. But I'm sure you have some good stories, and our audience would love to hear a couple to get us started off here.
So I can think of a really big mistake I made at a board meeting early on in my career. I had been working with a company that hired me because they told me that there was a sales problem. And I was CRO, so I got to run sales and marketing both. But they hired me with the expectation or telling me, you're going to have to come in and teach the sales team a whole lot of new stuff. And when I got there, I saw that the sales team was actually doing pretty well. They were winning like 32% of the time, which, is pretty decent. But I had diagnosed that the marketing function was really where things were falling down. If you're winning 32% of the time, you need like 3 or 3.5 times your goal in pipeline. So you've got enough deals to close. And they were operating at like 1 or 1.5. So I discovered this really early on, but I didn't talk about it until I showed up at the board meeting, like 2 or 3 months into the job at the end of the first quarter. And, I'm delivering this news about, here's how we're going to finish the quarter and here's what the next quarters are going to look like. But our focus is really all about marketing and lead gen. And as soon as the words came out of my mouth, I could see everyone around the table was like totally confused because it was not at all what they expected to hear. And it's not that the message was wrong, but it's that I waited until the board meeting to actually deliver it. And so it's actually really taught me that, the board meeting should feel like a formality. I work in a private equity context. I'm a go-to-market advisor to CROs right now. And so I have, daily or weekly relationships with the CROs in our portfolio companies. And those are great relationships to start previewing what are the messages you're going to share in your board meeting and start sharing, emails and reports and all of that kind of stuff early on. So that by the time you get to the board meeting, you've already had the discussions. People have, absorbed whatever they wanted to feel about the news you're delivering. You've probably already started to talk about course correction instead of assuming that we're going to be in this meeting for 3 hours. I'm deliver some kind of bombshell and everyone's mind is going to be in a great place to talk about what do we do about it too.
So I'm starting to understand, since that happened early in your career, why our first topic was on predictability. So it sounds like you decided predictability was a growth opportunity early on, and thus it became a main topic in this whole book and the first in our series.
Absolutely right. Yeah. And I think, we talked in our last episode about how the average tenure of a CRO is about 18 months. The average hold period of a tech company in a private equity firm is only about 4 or 5 years. And so if you think about the relationship with that board, they really don't want to have to replace their CROs because by the time you recruit someone, you onboard them and they change everything about their team, it really closes the window for how much time that new CRO has to make a difference. Um, and so it's really important that if you don't want to be the person on the wrong end of that stick, you can bring your board along through the good news and the bad news early on. They will stick with you through bad news as long as they know it's coming, because then they don't feel surprised and, like you've got this really erratic performance.
And that's an interesting angle too, because when we talk about catching people off guard, specifically within private equity, i.e. the topic of this book, most of those board members are on 5, 6, sometimes 10 different companies. So the ability for them to have detailed understanding or wait until the actual meeting is nearly impossible. So How do you
Exactly.
go about, in addition to those weeklies that you're talking about, what else do you do to pre-wire, pre-signal? How often? What is the right cadence? And is it a select board member? Is it all board members? Like as a CRO, how many are you communicating with on that regular basis?
Yeah. So, hopefully I've learned my lesson. I really do think the core of my conversation does begin with a weekly flash report that sales ops and I partner really closely on. And that gets distributed to everyone who has anything to do with sales. So it's every one of my sales managers, it's the entire C team of the company I work for, and it's every member of the board. So that on a weekly basis, there's a simple to digest email, and I have a template in the book that you can download and see, but an easy to digest email that says, here's our forecast, here's our commitment, here's what's at risk, here's what we're doing about it. A couple of bullets and a couple of data points. So it starts with, there should be no excuse for you missing it. But of course, we're all human and we know that people don't read all those emails. And so then I also make sure that I have, whoever the go-to-market person is or people are on the board, a cadence that every week, every other week, pick up the phone or send them a text or something to call attention to anything that's really unusual. Hey, you got my weekly flash report, but did you see, this particular thing? Here's what I've started to do about it already. And by the time we get to the board meeting, I'll tell you more about it. And behind the scenes, they start, telling folks too. So a lot of times, people always say like, oh, you ready to go to the board meeting? We produce all of these big decks. A lot of times the go-to-market thing is 40, 50 slides long, but a lot of times my portion of the board meeting is only 10 minutes because I don't need to go through every slide. I don't need to explain it all because they've heard it in the email. They've heard it socially. Maybe they've pre-read it. And now, we get to the meeting and it's like, oh yeah, that thing where you don't have any pipeline. Sounds like you've already got that under control. Let's move on to something else. And so those are the best board meetings for me. And the way I love to run a business if I
That
can.
minor detail of no pipeline.
Yeah. But, we already talked about it and,
We don't need to
a
beat
lot of board
that.
meetings.
We don't need to beat that. We've already discussed it. Let's move on. But
That's
I
right.
mean, that is the point of the board meeting. I mean, if you're transparent through weekly flashes and if you're transparent with the pre-read and you've got the binder of materials and you can turn to page 47 and explain the activities that you're doing to drive top of funnel, for example, then you can focus on strategy when you're in the board meeting and key decisions that are going to help rather than making it a status update. So
That's right.
what is your philosophy on sharing enough to keep them informed, but not so much so that they get mired into details that aren't helpful, as board members guiding you and making strategic decisions with you?
I think that's really tricky. And now as a board member myself, I hope that I'm adding value to the companies I'm working with. But I'm also really aware that a lot of people get onto boards and they feel like they need to contribute to prove their own value. And so I like to create a culture where I'm sharing some things, maybe setting up some problems that, you know, are easy to solve or have obvious solutions that I can let someone else collaborate on to contribute to that result. Um, and at the same time, when we've got really difficult problems that I don't know the answer to, I really want to bring them in and get their thoughts. But you've got to be careful because as you talked about, a lot of these folks sit on 5, 6, 7 boards at a time. And maybe there's a commonality that they're all B2B tech, but they're still operating in very different
Yeah.
contexts. And it's tricky to remind people that something that works in this environment doesn't necessarily work over there. And so a board member may walk in, really excited about SEO or content-based marketing or ABM because it's working really well in one of their other companies. And sometimes you have to be willing to say, that's a great idea. It doesn't work for us here. And this is why, we're a smaller market or our deals are smaller or different stuff like that. But it's a delicate balance to walk, to solicit involvement, take good ideas, but also reject the ones that aren't such good ideas without hurting people's feelings.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and when you mentioned B2B tech, that's always the fascinating one to me because, it sounds like there would be a lot of commonality and there is, but when, as a board member, you're going from what could be a cybersecurity discussion to a supply chain discussion to a, ITSM discussion, and then you're getting into a vertical app for, scheduling in a hospital. There's not a lot of commonality other than it's software technology. the how those businesses go to market, the problems they face, they're all different. So, being able to understand what the board is thinking is an interesting challenge. And I'll pose this question to you maybe as a build on that. So, understanding the board and understanding how to anticipate questions, in your book, you talk about how crucial it is to anticipate these questions. So, what are some of the frameworks that you've used to prepare and help predict where boards are going to be concerned before going to the board meeting itself?
Yeah. So if I'm stepping into the role, as the brand new CRO, the first thing that I want to do is get my hands on as many board decks or meeting minutes that have happened before I was there. Because often, and you hear this with interviews too, you'll often hear a common theme of, we moved on from the CRO because they were never able to answer this question. Or you go through the board decks and you see that the same issue keeps coming up. It's a big clue to the orientation of the people that are working with you. Um, but we talked about predictability. I also really like to talk about consistency, that once you've narrowed in on, the structure of what your report looks like, don't change it. Yes, it might be 30 slides long or 40 slides long, but I worked with a PE firm. Actually, my first exposure to PE, worked with a firm that delivered us the board deck and said, this is the framework. This is how all of our board meetings are run across all of our portfolio companies. Don't change anything about it. Don't change the font to blue. It's red for a reason. Maybe you don't have an international business. Leave that slide blank. Because, they've gotten a rhythm and a routine about how they're working that you should start to move into, that'll make it easier for them to consume.
Yeah. No, that's great advice. And as when you're working with different private equity firms, they like to see stuff in a common way. And there's a lot of similarities from one PE firm to the next. So that's one of the things that, SBI actually did to help onboard new CROs, is developed a best practice around how to deliver presentations that get boardroom results, because there's so many different learnings from them. And, some will want to jump straight into the details. Others will want to understand the big picture, but the flow is the flow. And, the board is going to have its own personality. Every one of them will. And, you got to understand that board and be able to anticipate how to best meet them where they're at. And I guess the other thing is it really matters on where the health of the business is too. I mean, if you're brought in as a turnaround person versus you were there pre-transaction and you're there to take it to the next level, very different tone and tenor in communicating with that board.
That's right. That's right. And, you've helped me with this a lot. We've gotten to work at a couple of companies within the same PE portfolio. I think one of the values of the PE firm is that they do have, 30, 40, 70 companies in the portfolio that you can benchmark across. And so, if as an individual company, you're willing to report in that format and get used to those routines, it makes it very easy for someone to say, hey, I need some help with comp. What's the average commission rate that people are spending? And to have a really quick, for companies of your size or your revenue or whatever it is, here's a best practice. And I know SBI has been really helpful at, helping establish a lot of that across portfolios in addition to just a single company at a time.
Yeah. And it is interesting on those metrics, how much those benchmarks vary within funds and within private equity firms, because they've all got their point of reference. So, a lot of times at SBI, we'll develop a broader reference point that spans multiple PE firms as well as public companies as well. But a benchmark is just that. It's a benchmark. And, everyone has different results and performance against the benchmark. And then that's where the art of this comes in. So how do you explain that difference? I mean, there's valid reasons. And, that's one of the things. So, as we kind of pivot to the end of this section, I think that's one of the challenges. I've seen too many scenarios where boards will use a benchmark against, an operating team and say, this is where we need you to be. And the reality is that may or may not be feasible without a level of investment to actually change something. So I think
I think you're right. And I'm sorry to step on you. But I also think even within the same business, I'm remembering a company that you and I worked together on that had an enterprise team that was doing $1 million deals, a mid-market team that was doing, $100,000 deals, and then an SMB team that was doing $5,000 deals. And so the expectations of, I'll wait for a 6 or 9 month sales cycle on the $1 million deal. As a B team, we've really got to figure out how that becomes a one call close.
Mhm.
So, what are the processes we're using? What are the metrics we're going to use? How do we motivate and inspire those teams? Might be different within the same company too, because they're operating in different segments or industries or product lines.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, benchmarks are kind of like polling data. You can always find one to serve your needs and serve your message, but it's the story around it. And that's where you've got to get people bought in and get them supportive of your strategy. And I think one of the most crucial components to doing that is follow up, right? When you get into the board meeting, it's one thing to get everyone stacking hands on the vision and the strategy that you've outlined, but far too often, you know, you're going to go back to your office. If you didn't happen to do a virtual board meeting in that case, and next thing you know, you're right back in the fires and,
Right.
following up and seeing those things through. And, I think we've all seen scenarios where there's little or no follow-up and the next board meeting is just a continued progress against said action that we discussed 3 months ago. Um, what advice do you have for people out there to make sure they're more diligent, or what tools or tricks do you have for follow up to make sure you're getting results and achieving them?
Yeah. I think it's communicating often. It's communicating in multiple venues and communicating the same thing over and over again. So what's your weekly cadence? What's your monthly cadence? What's your quarterly cadence of the things you communicate? Do you communicate it? Have I sent it on email? Have I sent it to you voice to voice? Have I said it in a board meeting context? And then am I giving you consistency from conversation to conversation? I went to school as a communication major and taught public speaking. And we've all heard that, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you've said. I constantly find every one of my, especially board communications, opening by saying, you'll all remember the last time we spoke, we agreed, blah, 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 blah. And I know full well a lot of people in the room don't remember that conversation at all, but it's at least signposting. We've had this conversation before. Here's where we landed. And let me set that context one more time so that now I can jump in and take you to the next place I want to bring you to.
Yeah. As you were saying that, that's where my mind was going. The classic, tell them what you're going to tell them again. I mean, no better way. And it applies for salespeople. It applies for sales leadership. It applies for executive level communication at the board level. I mean, it is kind of a table stake of any kind of effective communication, which, as we've discussed in this episode, is critical for beating the 18-month lifespan of the average CRO in private equity. So, JD, as always, thank you for joining us on this episode to discuss your book. We really appreciate some of the insights that you've brought us today. And during the next of our 3-part series, we will be discussing ages and stages of companies and why your company got to this stage will not necessarily work at its next stage. So more to follow on that. JD, look forward to seeing you on that episode soon.
Thanks so much, Tony.
Visit SBIgrowth.com to read SBI's latest research, join upcoming events, or learn about SBI's GTM services. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and connect with us on LinkedIn.